Welcome to the lecture on the components of an effective consulting proposal. Our objectives are to distinguish between a proposal and a contract, identify the key components of an effective consulting proposal, and understand the do's and don'ts of writing a strong proposal. I like to start each lecture by bringing us back to our model. At this point, we're still in the first stage of working with the client. So you've had your meetings with the client and now you're ready for a proposal or a contract. I want to make sure that we start by distinguishing between a proposal and a legally binding contract. Legally binding contracts include 6 components. 1, an offer or promise between you and the other party, that both parties have accepted the offer, that there is valid consideration so that both parties are exchanging something of value, that there's mutuality of obligation, so similar to consideration, both parties are bound to perform their obligations and both have been given equal rights regarding termination. 5, competency and capacity. So each party must have legal capacity to enter into a contract. For instance, you can't be drunk when signing the contract. And typically there's a written instrument. So not all contracts need to be in writing unless indicated by the statute of frauds, but I highly recommend that you have something in writing with every client. So here are some key points. If you want a legally binding proposal template, then you should seek out the assistance of an attorney. I'm not a lawyer. I will be providing components that should be in a proposal or a contract from our field and our perspective, but you may also want to speak with a lawyer. Larger organizations will actually require a legally binding contract prepared by their legal team. So this can be somewhat of a pain. It can contain a lot of legal jargon, and so you may want to have an attorney look at it. Sometimes they'll actually put your proposal in the appendix, so it's not a waste of time for you to create a proposal. And FYI, some organizations will also require you to have liability insurance. The components in this lecture then are highly recommended for proposals and contracts. In addition, like I mentioned, to the legal language and components. And unless there's some request for proposal with a specific structure, you will need to provide a proposal, but you might not need every component that we're going to be discussing in this lecture. Now, just as a note, I will require every one of these components in the proposal that's due for this class because I want you to get experience with it. Remember that the proposal is just a summation of the conceptual agreement that you already made in your conversations with the client. So there shouldn't be any surprises for the client in this proposal, and most of your negotiations, except possibly fees, have already been accomplished. Here are the proposal components that we're going to discuss. These are based on Block and Verlander and Weiss and my own experiences. So let's go through each one of them. So likely you're going to want to start your proposal with a title, perhaps a title page, maybe an executive summary, and/or an introduction. Some view these as optional, and honestly, all 3 probably is overkill. But your objectives here are just to be professional and to lay the foundation for the proposal. I recommend that you develop a template that has your logo. You don't have to pay to have one created. You can just put something together yourself if you'd like. But you also want to make sure that you have a standard header and footer in this template that you're going to use. Concise is key for a proposal. If it's longer for some reason, you may want to include a table of contents and even have some hyperlinks. Then you include the statement of the problem or the opportunity. So this is a clear and concise rephrasing of the problem or the opportunity that you, again, already discussed with the client. You don't need to use lofty language or any unclear verbiage. Just be really straightforward. You don't need to state who the company is or give their history. They already know that information. And I really encourage you to try to phrase this positively. So if you've been hired to do training for customer service reps, let's say, you don't want to say something like, I'm offering training to fix them because they are performing poorly. Instead, you want to write something like, customer satisfaction ratings are down and the company would like to enhance the performance of the customer service rep. So that just phrases it in a more positive way. Then you include the objectives or outcomes for the project. I recommend providing 3 to 5 clear, realistic project objectives. So you don't want too many, and you don't want to overstate these or include any goals or objectives that won't be directly impacted by your services. So for example, I've mentioned that I do strategic planning. Well, if a company brings me in and they say they want to grow their business, but I'm just there facilitating strategic planning, I'm not going to put grow their business as one of my objectives. So I'll put that I'm facilitating the retreat or something to that effect, but not other objectives that I don't have control over. Each objective or outcome should have one quantitative or qualitative metric. So ideally, your objectives are measurable, but they don't always have to be quantitative. They can also be qualitative. So, for instance, if I'm hired to conduct a SWOT analysis and summarize the findings in a report, the metric is the report. That's the outcome. It's not a number, but it is tangible. And you also want to make sure that you don't include any metrics or return on investment that aren't or can't be measured. So again, if a client wants to grow their presence in the market, well, how are you going to measure presence in the market? Now they have to figure that out, or you're responsible for measuring it. So I like to pick measures that are going to be, again, directly impacted by what I do and hopefully are already being measured or easy to measure. And sometimes I'll even collect the baseline data. So for example, I also help organizations start employee mentoring programs. And a lot of the time they want to increase retention. Well, I'm not going to say that my program will increase retention because there are way too many factors that impact retention, like supervisors and pay. Now, there is research that supports mentoring and retention, so I could include that somewhere. But instead, I'm going to include something that's concrete, that I'm going to help start a program that provides mentoring partnerships to 25 new employees, something like that is tangible, it's quantifiable, and what I'm doing directly impacts it. Also, I'd just like to note here that I typically combine the proposal, introduction, problem statement, and objectives into one section. You also want to include background information and a needs assessment. So you want to summarize the background and the facts that you learned in your meetings. And in doing so, you really want to be mindful of fact versus opinion and avoid assumptions. Remember, you've only spoken with 1 or 2 people, and this may be their perspective. So just be careful how you write this information when you do the needs assessment. In the proposal, you may also want to include that you'll be collecting additional data and how that will be done. And I also want to mention again that you may include this background information and needs assessment in the same section as the statement of the problem and opportunity. It just depends how much information you have and how much you've already collected as part of the needs assessment. Most important, you want to share the scope of work and the schedule and timelines. So you clearly and concisely state the work that you're doing, and that includes design that you're doing, development, delivery, implementation, evaluation. These are the methods that you're using and what you're doing. I recommend that it's organized into sections or phases or even options that the client can choose from, and that you put it into a bulleted format. Again, so it's just really concise and easy for them to read, and they know exactly what you're doing. In this section, you can also include the schedule and timeline for each phase. I'd only include the actual dates if those are firm. Sometimes it's better to just say, this will take 45 days instead of giving an actual date, because you don't know when the contract will be signed. In the proposal, include a bulleted list of roles and responsibilities for you and the client or the organization. You want to specify who the point of contact is for each party and who will be serving on your team if you have other consultants working with you or an assistant. And you also want to specify this on the organization's side if appropriate. Sometimes I'll include the role of an executive assistant on their side, because I find, especially when I'm working with physicians, that they don't want to handle logistics and things like that. Which brings me to the next bullet. You want to make sure to include logistics, like who's going to schedule meetings or handle travel arrangements. This is important because sometimes there's an expectation that you will be doing these types of things, and that might not be within your scope, and you might not even have the authority to do that. You could also include some joint accountabilities or responsibilities for both parties. And I like this statement from Alan Weiss. He puts, as a joint accountability, we both will immediately inform the other of any developments we find that might materially affect the success of the project, whether directly related to the project or not. In the proposal, you also want to specify the terms and conditions, which are your statement of fees, expenses, billing terms, and termination. So you should clearly and thoroughly describe the fees for the work. I want to say a little bit more about this. You'll want to decide your pricing up front and create some standard pricing to use with your clients. And it will differ from client to client. So you may be using a set price or a price range. For some, you might use a retainer if it's ongoing work and use of your expertise, or it could be an hourly rate. I will warn you that seasoned consultants do not believe in an hourly rate because it minimizes your past experiences. It doesn't include materials and things you've previously developed. I actually do a combination of both a set price and an hourly rate by the nature of my work. So even if I give them a set price, I find that sometimes the client keeps adding work, and that's why I include my hourly rate. You also will want to decide on your travel rate and how that travel will be reimbursed. And so you should think about it and talk with them about, is this going to be per diem? Will you be submitting receipts? And then up there at the top, are they purchasing your intellectual property? So you want to consider that. You shouldn't just give them your materials and allow them to reuse those. You may want to determine a fee for those. I encourage you to look into your field for best practices or to speak with someone who is experienced. In the beginning, you may charge less and you may do some small pro bono jobs to get the experience, but they say that most consultants are actually underchargers, and you need to be willing to walk away from the business. Your proposal in this section should include appropriate terms for billing. So are they going to pay you within 60 days of the invoice? Is there an upfront financial commitment? Are they paying you 1/3 upfront for development? Are you billing them monthly? So you want to specify those things. And then what about termination and any changes to the scope of the work? How much notice do they need to give? And you definitely want to specify that they have to pay for work that's already done. You might want to include a confidentiality statement, which can protect both parties by specifying how each will share information and with whom. This is optional depending on the type of work that you're doing. Larger organizations will require this. Healthcare organizations will require this. I think it's nice to put this in so that you can protect how you'll be using and sharing any data that you collect and how you'll keep that confidential or anonymous. And you also may want to put in here how your works or intellectual property will be protected. So you can see Peter Block's book on page 64 for a good example. I also encourage you to include a biographical statement within the proposal or at the end. So even if the client knows me, others will likely see the proposal, and I want them to see my bio and build credibility with them. I like to put it on its own page after the signature in the appendix and have a picture with it as well. Your bio should include elements from your background, expertise, and experience that are relevant to that audience. So you should have different bios for different audiences, different types of work. You may even have short and long bios. I have different bios for healthcare versus university clients versus corporate training clients. I also recommend including short quotes and testimonials from past clients and jobs. Again, make sure that these are relevant to the client. You want to collect these while you're working with clients, and they're also great for your marketing materials. And then last, you have a closing statement that shares enthusiasm and next steps. But honestly, I do this closing statement a lot of times in an email, assuming that it's not integral to the proposal. Anything that's integral to the proposal should be in the proposal. If there are different options or phases, then you might actually want to put some check boxes so they can select those. That saves some time. You don't have to go back and forth or edit the proposal. Obviously, you'll have signature lines with the date. And if necessary, you might have an appendix. It might include something like your framework or a sample, but you want to make sure that you don't share too much up front. Here again are the components of a good proposal. Again, not every component is in every proposal, but you will need to include all of them in the one for this course that allow you to practice it, and you'll also have a template for the future. Proposals in general should be concise, well organized, and definitely without errors. So if you're not a detail-oriented person, then get someone to review your proposals for you. Although we've gone through a lot of components, it's best if these proposals are about 2 pages for the actual body of the proposal, unless, of course, you're doing something more complicated. In Blackboard, I've also included some sample proposals from Alan Weiss. Thank you for watching.